Japanese gods and goddesses. When we talk about the Japanese gods and goddesses, we must understand that much of the mythology and pantheon is derived from the traditional folklores of the Shinto, one of the major religions of Japan. And interestingly enough, much like Hinduism, Shinto, or kami-no-michi, the way of the gods, is a polytheistic mode of religion that results from the highly pluralistic culture of Japan throughout history. In essence, Shinto, without any proclaimed founder or prescribed tenets, can be perceived as the evolution of local animalistic beliefs of Yayoi culture, 300 BC, 300 AD, that were further influenced by both Buddhism and even Hinduism throughout the course of centuries. And given the nature of these localized folklores, intermixed with the myths of venerated entities of Buddhism and Hinduism, the Japanese gods and goddesses are deities mostly based on the kami, the mythical spirits and supernatural beings of the land. In terms of history, the first of these mythologies were documented in written forms by the early 8th century, thus serving as a standardized, or at least generalized, template of Shinto pantheon for most of Japan. To that end, most of the mythical narratives of the Japanese gods and goddesses are derived from the codified books Kojiki, circa 708 to 714 AD, Nihon Shoki, circa 720 AD, and the 9th century Kagitsuchi, that compiled the oral folklores that were missing from the earlier two codified documents. 1. Izonomy and Izagi, the primordial Japanese gods of creation. Like most creation myths, the Shinto Japanese myth also consists of the primordial gods. Called Izanagi, Izanagi no Mikoto or He Who Invites, and Izonomy, Izonomy no Mikoto or She Who Invites, the duo of brother and sister are perceived as the divine beings who brought order to the sea of the chaos below heaven by creating the first landmass, in the form of the island of Onogoro. Interestingly enough, most narratives concur that they were directed to do so by an even earlier generation of kami, divine beings, who resided in the plane of heaven. Even more intriguing is the way the duo created the landmass, by standing on the bridge or stairway to heaven, Amano Hashidate, and stirring the chaotic ocean below with their jewel-encrusted spear, thereby giving rise to the island of Onogoro. However, in spite of their apparent ingenuity, things soon fell out of favor, with their first union creating a deformed offspring, the god Hiriko, or Yebasu, discussed later in the article. Izanagi and Izonomy went on to create more land masses and give birth to other divine entities, thereby giving form to the principal 8 islands of Japan and over 800 kami. Unfortunately, in the arduous process of creation, Izonomy died from the burning pain of giving birth to Kagitsuchi, the Japanese fire god, and is consequently sent to the underworld, Yomi. The grief-stricken Izanagi followed his sister Izonomy to the underworld, and he even succeeded in convincing the older generation of gods to allow her to return to the realm of the living. But the brother, impatient from waiting too long, takes a premature look at the undead state of the sister, which was more akin to a rotting, decomposing corpse. A host of angry thunder kami attached to this body chased Izanagi out of the underworld, and he just about escaped from Yomi by blocking the entrance with a huge stone. A cleansing ritual followed, whereby Izanagi inadvertently created even more Japanese gods and goddesses, the Mahashira no Yuzunomiko, like Amadorasu, the sun goddess birthed from the washing of his left eye, Tsukiomi, the moon god birthed from the washing of his right eye, and Susanoo, the storm god birthed from his nose. To that end, in Shinto culture, cleansing, harai, is an important part of the ritual before entering the sacred shrines. 2. Yebasu, the Japanese god of luck and fishermen. As we mentioned in the earlier entry, Hiriko, leech child, the very first child of the primordial duo Izanagi and Izonomy, was born in a deformed state, which, according to the mythical narrative, was due to a transgression in their marriage ritual. However, in some narratives, Hiriko was later identified with the Japanese god Yebasu, possibly by the medieval times, a deity of fishermen and luck. In that regard, the myth of Yebasu was possibly modified to accommodate his divine, and rather indigenous, lineage amongst the Japanese kami. In essence, Yebasu, or Hiriko, after being born without bones, was said to have been set adrift in the ocean at age 3. In spite of this immoral trial, the child, by luck, somehow managed to come ashore to one Yebasu Saburo. The child then grew through various hardships to call himself Yebasu or Yebasu, thereby becoming the patron god of fishermen, children, and most importantly wealth and fortune. Pertaining to the latter attribute, Yebasu is often considered as one of the primary deities of the 7 gods of fortune, Shichifukujin, whose narrative is influenced by local folklores as opposed to foreign influence. As for depictions, in spite of his numerous adversities, Yebasu maintains his jovial mood, often called the laughing god, and wears a tall, pointed cap folded in the middle called Kazori Eboshi. In an interesting note, Yebasu is also the god of jellyfishes, given his initial boneless form. 3. Kagitsuchi, the Japanese god of destructive fire. The Japanese god of fire, Kagitsuchi, or Homusubi, he who starts fire, was another offspring of the primordial Izanagi in Izonomy. In a tragic twist of fate, his fiery essence burned his own mother Izonomy, which led to her death and departure to the underworld. In a fit of rage and revenge, his father Izanagi proceeded to lop off Kagitsuchi's head, and the spilled blood led to the creation of even more kami, including martial thunder gods, mountain gods, and even a dragon god. Simply put, Kagitsuchi was regarded as the forebearer of various distant potent and powerful deities who even brought forth the creation of iron and weapons in Japan, possibly mirroring the foreign influence in different armaments of Japan. As for the history and cultural side of affairs, Kagitsuchi, as a god of fire, was unsurprisingly perceived as a potential agent of destruction to Japanese buildings and structures typically made of wood and other combustible materials. Suffice it to say, in Shinto religion, he becomes the focus of different appeasing rituals, with one ceremony pertaining to the Hoshizu no Matsuri, an imperial custom that was designed to ward off the destructive effects of Kagitsuchi for 6 months. 4. Amadorasu, the Japanese goddess of the rising sun. Amadorasu or Amadorasu Amakami, the glorious kami who illuminates from heaven, also known by her honorific title Ohiru no Mochi no Kami, the great son of the kami, is venerated as the goddess of the sun and the ruler of the realm of the kami, the high celestial plane or Takuma no Hara. In many ways, as queen of the kami, she espouses the grandeur, order, and purity of the rising sun, while also being the mythical ancestor of the Japanese imperial family, thus alluding to their mythical lineage in the Japanese culture. Her epithet suggests her role as the leader of the gods, with the rulership directly granted by her father Izanagi, the creator of many Japanese gods and goddesses. In that regard, one of the crucial Shinto myths talks about how Amadorasu herself, as one of the Mihashira no Yuzunomiko, was birthed from the cleansing of Izanagi's left eye, as mentioned in our first entry. Another popular myth pertains to how Amadorasu locked herself in a cave after having a violent altercation with Susanoo, the storm god. Unfortunately, for the world, her radiant aura, epitomizing the effulgent sun, was hidden, thus covering the lands in darkness. And it was only after a series of friendly distractions and pranks concocted by the other Japanese gods that she was convinced to come out of the cave, which once again resulted in the advent of radiant sunlight. As for the lineage in cultural terms, the Japanese imperial line is mythically derived from the grandson of Amadorasu, Ninigi no Mikoto, who was offered the rulership of Earth by his grandmother. On the historical side of affairs, Amadorasu, or her equivalent deity, had always been important in the Japanese lands, with many noble families claiming lineage from the sun deity. But her prominence was rather enhanced after the Meiji Restoration, in accordance with tenets of Shinto state religion. 5. Tsukiomi, the Japanese god of the moon. In contrast to many Western mythologies, the moon deity in Japanese Shinto is a male, given the epithet of Tsukiomi no Mikoto or simply Tsukiomi, Tsuku probably meaning moon, month, and Yomi referring to reading. He is one of the Mihashira no Yuzunomiko, being born from washing of Izanagi's right eye, therefore making him the brother of Amadorasu, the sun goddess. In some myths, he is born from a white copper mirror held in the right hand of Izanagi. As for the mythical narrative, Tsukiomi, the god of the moon, went on to marry his sister Amadorasu, the goddess of the sun, thereby allowing for the union of both the sun and the moon in the same sky. However, the relationship was soon shattered when Tsukiomi killed Yayoi, the goddess of the food. The heinous act was apparently carried out of disgust, and the moon god was witness to Yayoi spitting out of various food items. In response, Amadorasu broke off with Tsukiomi by moving to another part of the sky, thus making day and night completely separate. 6. Susanoo, the Japanese god of seas and storms. Born from the nose of Izanagi, the father of Japanese gods, Susanoo was a member of the trio of Mahashira no Izonomiko, thereby making him a brother to both Amadorasu and Tsukiomi. As for his attributes, Susanoo was perceived as a temperamental, disheveled kami who is prone to chaotic mood swings, thus alluding to his power over the ever-changing storms. Mythically, the mercurial nature of his benevolence and malevolence also extends to the seas and winds near the coast, where many of his shrines are located in South Japan. Talking of myths, Susanoo is often celebrated in the Shinto folklore as the guileful champion who defeated the evil dragon, or monstrous serpent, Yamata no Orochi by cutting off all its 10 heads after imbibing them with alcohol. After the encounter, he recovered the famed sword Kusanagi no Tsurugi and also won the hand of the woman who he saved from the dragon. On the other hand, Susanoo is also portrayed in a somewhat negative light, thus reflecting the storm god's chaotic nature, especially when it comes to his rivalry with Amadorasu, the leader and sun goddess of the kami. On one occasion, their challenge to each other turned bitter, with the wrathful Susanoo going on a rampage by destroying the sun goddess's rice fields and even killing one of her attendants. In response, the angry Amadorasu retreated into a dark cave, thus snatching away her divine light from the world, while the ever-boisterous Susanoo went away from heaven. 7. Raijin and Fujin, the Japanese gods of weather. Talking of storms and duality of character, Raijin and Fujin are considered the powerful kami of the elements of nature who can be favoring or disagreeable to the plights of mortals. To that end, Raijin is the deity of thunder and lightning who unleashes his tempests with wielding of his hammer and beating of drums. Interestingly enough, Raijin is depicted with 3 fingers, each representing the past, present, and future. Fujin, on the other hand, is the fearsome monstrous kami of the winds, who carries his fair share of gales and gusts in a bag on his shoulders. According to few myths, it was Fujin who saved Japan during the Mongol invasions by unleashing a typhoon on the approaching fleet, which was later called the kamikaze, divine wind. However, other samurai-related myths call it the work of Hachiman, the god of war, discussed later in the article. Interestingly enough, there is a hypothesis regarding how Fujin was possibly inspired by Greco-Buddhist deity Wardo, venerated along the Silk Route, who, in turn, was derived from the Greek wind god Boreas. 8. Aim-no-Yuzum, the Japanese goddess of dawn and dancing. The jovial female deity of the dawn, which sort of made her the assistant to Amadorasu, the deity of the sun, Aim-no-Yuzum also espoused the spontaneity of nature. This latter aspect made her the patron goddess of creativity and performing arts, including dancing. To that end, one of the central myths in Shinto pertains to how Amadorasu, the sun goddess, locked herself in a dark cave after falling out with Susanoo, the storm god. This resulted in the arrival of darkness over the heavens and the earth. So, in a bid to distract the other anxious kami, Aim-no-Yuzum, by virtue of her intrinsic spontaneity and creativity, covered herself in leaves of sakaki tree. She then started making cheery cries and it followed up by gleeful dancing atop a platform. She even resorted to removing her clothes, which led to amusement among the other gods who started roaring in joy and laughter. The ensuing merriment stirred the curiosity of Amadorasu, who finally came out of her cave, and thus the world was once again covered in radiant sunlight.